doesn't have its own body of property law. They just apply what was the property law in 1967, namely Ottoman and Jordanian property law. Does anyone know a good Ottoman real estate lawyer? They're hard to find these days. There is no environmental law, and so pollution and dumping are very difficult. If you want to do a normal thing like build a road or a school or get a permit to fix up your house, you have to go through a military bureaucracy. Doing any of those things in Israel is already very bureaucratic and takes 20 years. Here it takes, 30 years. So, any kind of, compare this. So it's just administratively difficult and awkward for no good reason. The original reason was maybe there'll be peace. And so, why switch the rules one way and then switch them another? But now these places and normal life in them is being held hostage to Palestinian rejection. But what is proposed is not, this is not about staking sovereign claims. Applying Israeli law to territory does not mean that one is, for example, not asserting sovereignty over all of Judea and Samaria. This is simply how these areas are governed in terms of the Jewish communities. And the proposals are simply to apply direct Knesset jurisdiction merely to the Yeshuvim, the places where the Jews live, and to the Jordan Valley, which is a security bubble. But this is not about what the final borders are. These are not useful borders, and the final borders may be broader or narrower. But this is about normalizing these places. And so, no Arab is going to be, not only is no Arab be removed from their home, or no new territory would come under Israeli control, but rather, the lives of the Palestinians will not be changed in any way on a daily basis, because the 30% to which Israeli law will be applied is dafka the 30%, specifically the 30% where the Jews live and where the Palestinians don't. So this is simply, as a practical matter, it's just a change in the administrative procedures for the areas where the Jews live.
From everything that I have read, look, you are considered an expert, world-renowned expert in international law. And your opinion should matter as much as other people's opinion in terms of experts. The impression when Jerusalem was united after 67, I think they used the word annex as well, as it was.
They did not, by the way, it's very important that the mechanism that is, that would be used now is exactly the same mechanism as for Jerusalem.
And go
on. Slightly different.
Okay.
Because in 1967, Israel passed a law saying that the cabinet can, by just a government decision, from time to time, apply and extend Israeli jurisdiction and administration to any part of Eretz Israel. So, and at the time, they did it not just, by the way, to Jerusalem, but also to other areas of what was the Jordanian West Bank, because parts of what that was incorporated into municipality of Jerusalem was not just the Eastern Jerusalem municipality, but also outlying towns. Like Issawiya was not part of Jerusalem; it was just a neighboring village. So they just applied Israeli jurisdiction there, and this would just be another decision to apply Israeli jurisdiction in new places under the under that existing law.
So, would the communities of Judea and Samaria have the same? Would they be treated no differently than Tel Aviv, Haifa, Ramat Gan? Would they be exactly the same in terms of everything?
Yeah, and yes, exactly. And we can see what a big difference this makes. Because this was done in Jerusalem, 53 years later, Jerusalem has, the parts of Jerusalem that came under Israeli control in 1967 have as many or more Jewish inhabitants as all of the huge Judea and Samaria. Why? Because you can build normal neighborhoods, you can have normal, because it's integrated. So, it's a statement how this sort of limbo status stunts development, that there's only, as many people in all of Judea and Samaria, as many Jews as there are in, Eastern Jerusalem.
As you know, the entire world has reacted to this basically in a very negative way. Even Israel's friends, almost making this like the end of the world. God knows what will be. The peace that has never come, this will interfere with the peace. why is everyone so up in arms, so concerned? Is it just the natural reaction because Israel is doing this? What exactly is going on in terms of the rest of the world going absolutely crazy?
They're concerned because they believe that Israel is finally going to achieve independence. That is to say, that Israel will be acting in a way that is not completely dependent on their approval. And, the way they see the world, very much like this controversial Peter Beinart article, that Israel's legitimacy is conditional on the Palestinians. The Palestinians and their potential state are what legitimate Israel. So if Israel is doing something that is not approved by the Palestinians, that is, seems to be acting on its own, that is for its own sake, that has no legitimacy. And they're afraid that their entire dreams of this, 1967 borders are being thrown out the window, because what this does, and what the Trump peace vision does, is it rejects a central component of this 1967 borders idea, which is that Jews living in places is a problem, a crime, and a legitimate and just step for peace is the expulsion of Jews for their homes. And peace processors, quietly and without putting it in these many words, embraced a completely disgusting premise of the Palestinians as part of their peace plan, because they thought, well, hey, the Palestinians are insistent, we have to give it to them because we want them to agree. And that was that the Palestinian state should be pre-cleansed of Jews. So here, by saying that all Jews in Judea and Samaria get to stay where they are, we don't plan on removing anyone, that is a rejection of this illiberal demand for the pre-cleansing.
Yeah. Let me ask you, from a law perspective, international law, you have made it very, very clear that this is not a violation of international law. But I think you are the exception to that. Am I correct? I mean, most professors, law professors all over the world are reacting that this is a violation of international law. This is a violation of the rights of the Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. How are they looking at the law different than you are looking at the law?
Most professors don't care. There's a small group of professors who regularly care and write about this stuff. Not surprisingly, like many academic communities, they are insular and self-selected in a way that vindicates and magnifies their own views. They believe that whatever the United Nations passes in a resolution is law, which we don't generally believe. I mean, people always ask me, why is everyone? What's the strongest argument on the other side? If I thought they were so strong, I'd believe in them. I'd be making them myself. I think they're principally appeals to authority. They're exactly what we said. Well, everyone agrees, or the United Nations agrees, or the United Nations has said 100 times. But the United Nations is not a lawmaking body. They can say 1,000 times, and they cannot change the existing borders or rights of countries. They cannot create an occupation where the Geneva Convention says there is no occupation.
The Israeli government was supposed to announce something July 1st regarding.
No, we're not. No, the July 1st.
So tell me what's actually going on. Is anybody getting cold feet in Israel? Is anyone getting nervous? I'm talking about the government. I'm talking about Netanyahu. Is there a sudden concern about, let's move slowly? I read something just today that maybe they're going to modify what they were going to do. What, as far as you know, what is going on?
No one really knows, but Netanyahu is cautious by nature. But I think he wants to do this. Gantz clearly does not want to do this. It's quite clear he does not want to do this. He is afraid of the Europeans. He does not want to do this. And it's not really up to him, but certainly when the Americans read headlines that the alternate prime minister of Israel is unexcited about this, it makes the Americans less excited too. So I think Gantz is trying to sort of basically cool off the Americans on this so that he will not be put to the question himself.
Let me ask you,
and also, there's a lot of other stuff going on, so everyone's a little distracted.
So as far do you expect that there's going to be movement in the coming weeks towards some kind of policy, or is this going to schlep along? And also, along with that, one of the reasons that Israel was really pursuing this all had to do with the American administration, specifically President Trump. I mean, this was the opportunity to get this done, because there's no other country in the world that was talking the talk, and America is still the leading country in the world. How important is that Trump connection to all this? And who's getting nervous, the Israelis or the Americans?
The Americans are not getting nervous. And I wouldn't say the Israelis are getting nervous. I think, the Israelis have failed to form a stable one-party-led government in 4 elections. And what they have now is, better than nothing, right? Better than the complete failure to form a government. But at the same time, it leaves, it's a two-headed beast. And those heads are saying different things. And that itself makes the Americans less excited. I think it is understood that if anything happens, it has to happen during a Trump administration, that there is no other window of opportunity, that this will not happen again. And that I think is all the more reason to do it now. But certainly, I don't think the Israelis, no one can tell you what's going to happen now. Everything keeps changing day to day. And there's other concerns and other distractions in Iran and the coronavirus. But, I don't think the window of opportunity is closed, but certainly in the fall, it will be rapidly closing.
How important is it for the American government, the Israelis, they present their plan with working with the United States from an international, whether it's international law, how important is it that America is saying, this is kosher, this is okay, we recognize this? What role does that play? I mean, it's obviously very different if America says it than most other countries in the world. How important is that?
America has already said all the sort of legally important stuff, right? In January and in November, Secretary Pompeo made quite clear that the United States does not regard the presence of Jews in these places, settlements, settlers, as a violation of international law. So, and the United States has also made clear that whatever Israel does with these places, what it chooses to do, is a matter for Israel to decide. And Israel hasn't yet, adopted a clear position, unfortunately. But in the end, the U.S. approval of this is not the essence. It's unlikely to be, followed or accepted by other countries. Subsequent administration may well undo it, and that's fine, because the way I see it, the U.S. Ratification is just a ladder. It's just a tool. It would be good if Israel just did this itself, as it did with Jerusalem in 1967. How happy are we that Israel did not wait for American or European acceptance to apply Israeli, law to the Kotel and the old city? We wouldn't have the Israel we have today if they hadn't acted that way.
Right.
So today we have a very cautious prime minister and a crazy situation. The U.S. acceptance would make it, would dampen the immediate diplomatic fallout in a way that could make this more easily politically realizable for Israel. So, in a sense, it's a crutch for Israel. Ideally, right, they should not be able to use this crutch, but if they have to, it's better than nothing.
Well, the faster they do something, the better, because
yes,
in terms of time, having a couple of months of the Trump administration for things to set in is definitely going to be helpful. You're right. Look, the Democrats are already threatening. We don't know exactly what they're threatening, but their position is radically different from what the Trump administration. So it is important for Israel to move ahead. Let me ask you.
And I think it's important to point out, some people say, well, maybe that's a reason not to do it because, because what the Biden administration is going to get upset. The position of the Democrats isn't just radically different from the Trump administration. It's radically, different from the position of the Democrats 10 years ago. That is, so, it's, I think it's self-decepting to think if Israel does this, then the Biden administration will be angry, and if they don't, everything will be fine. The Biden administration is likely to bring in, very progressive people from the Center for American Progress and we can think of some of the people who they're going to be to run their Middle East policy, and these people are not going to say, annexation not kosher, but the ongoing apartheid occupation and denial of Palestinian self-determination, fine. They're going to do what they're going to do anyway, and the only question is what's going to be the alleged excuse. So whatever the alleged excuse is going to be the last thing Israel did. So
Israel needs to, what you're basically saying, which is Israel needs to be strong and do what it thinks is right for the people of Israel. And the rest of it, Israel has gone through a history with different presidents. I think the Trump administration has been unprecedented in terms of Israel on so many different levels. But if Trump doesn't get reelected and does not look good right now, then things are going to be quite different next year in terms of the relationship between Israel and the US. There's no question about that.
Yes, whether Israel does this or not. So, in my view, it makes more sense to get, more, to gain yardage while, you have the ball and get the ball as far down the field as possible, because, when the other side has it, they're going to be
right. Let me ask you, within the area that is being discussed for Israel to, let me use the word annex, there are 43, I saw 43 Arab communities within that area with over 100.
Quite small.
Okay, but over 100,000 people. What happens to all those communities that are within this area? And number two, I want to ask you, the plan that is on the table or that Israel is thinking and talking about, is that going to include all, and by the way, I hate calling them settlements. They are cities, They are communities of Judea and Samaria. They're beautiful. I've been to 50 of them, 60. They are not settlements. They're cities and communities. Does the plan include all the areas where the Jews live within Judea and Samaria, or there are some exceptions?
The plan includes all the areas in which the Jews live, and really, it's 30% of Area C, and this whole mapping process is, drawing circles around those lines around those 30%. The notion that it will include 100,000 Arabs is ludicrous. I think 10,000 would be the max. And to think about it, Israel and America have 30% to work with. They're not going to use those 30% on Palestinian communities. So the Palestinian communities will not fall under Israeli law, with maybe extraordinarily rare exceptions that will be very small.
But Professor, how do you draw those lines, looking at a map and where there are some of these communities? Most people.
So it will not be contiguous. Some of these places will not be contiguous. There is no way to draw any kind of maps for for any peace process, for any Palestinian anything, any Israeli anything, without having both sides have some, discontiguity when you look on the map. But the areas really, the spaces we're talking about are tiny, right? The distances we're talking about are tiny. So it's very easy to create transportation contiguity, tunnels, bridges, etc. That people from, one community, the Palestinian community, can drive to other Palestinian places without any interruption, without seeing any Israelis, and without any checkpoints, and vice versa. Going forward, to have both communities live side by side, that's going to be a necessity in any case.
Can I ask you, going a little broader, do you ever see the possibility in our lifetime that there will be someone to talk to on the other side? I mean, we've gone through, Ehud Olmart's, he had the real deal of the century for the other side. And you had Ehud Barak, who had the best deal in the world for the other side. And none of that happened. I mean, that was the opportunity that will never come again. Do you, as someone, you made Aliyah, you live in Israel, we know the situation as it exists today. Is there any possibility ever that you see that something changes where people can live in some kind of peace, cold peace, warm peace, whatever it is?
I think people live in peace now. I think, it's very important to not confuse the peace process with actual peace. Currently, Israel and the areas under its control are the most peaceful places in the Middle East. Since the Arab Spring in 2011, these were the only places from Morocco to, Iraq that did not see massive violence, coups, revolutions, etc. the level of actual, violence through terrorism is, much less than average American city street crime. So peace is what we have now. During, of course, the peace process of Oslo, peace was what we didn't have. That's when we had,
all the violence and terrible
buses blowing up, and pizzerias being blown up. There's a difference between peace and peace process. Peace is what we have now. Whether we will have a Palestinian government that is committed to some kind of idea of actual reconciliation, there are no positive indicators at this moment. Life is long and things can change, but right now there's no positive indication.
Yeah, it's amazing, the situation. We just had two of your colleagues in Israel. We did a webinar with them. One is a former member of the Labor Party, and one is
Is that in not Wilf?
Yeah. Writing about the Palestinian refugee issue going back to 1948. A remarkable book that deals with, from people on the left, about, that there's no one to talk to. I mean, that this whole thing is a farce, this whole thing. But you know what? The world at large, with a few exceptions, just doesn't see it that way. They are still blind. Forget about the Palestinians, forget about the Arabs, but the rest of the world, the democracies of the world, the Europeans, what's their problem from your perspective? I mean, really, a little deeper, what is going on? They see the situation.
I wouldn't paint this too exaggeratedly. I wouldn't say most of the world doesn't agree. The professional European bureaucrats who deal with this do not agree. We see that most of the rest of the world has really stopped caring about this issue. Certainly the Arab countries have lost all interest and patience for this. And, India and the developing world, so why are they, what's the question? Why are the Europeans the way they are? I don't really.
Yeah.
I'm not a social psychologist. I don't know. I can't explain mass pathologies of societies. Let me put it this way. There are many reasons, and they are overdetermined.
Right.
One reason for sure is that the Europeans, everyone, there's a clash of ideologies between Israel and Europe. They're like Athens and Sparta. Why couldn't they just get along? Not because they had any actual territorial conflict, because they had a clash of ideologies. And Europe has given up, what they worked for 400 years, independent nation states. They gave that up very quickly for a new kind of post-war idea of cosmopolitanism and pan-nationalism. So they're threatened ideologically by a nationalist country. Israel is a challenge to their ideology. When they decided to get rid of nationalism, it's kind of like communism. You have to do it for everyone, otherwise they're going to feel left behind. And it would be one thing. This is why they don't mind the Palestinians. It would be one thing if they could look at these nationalists as like backwards, primitive, people. They're not like us. But when you see it's a technologically advanced state, it's doing well, and they're religious too. This is very troubling for them. This is very troubling. This is why also they don't like Abe in Japan and Modi in because they're all religious nationalists. They're personally, not so religious, but they're like supporters. Like they're on the side of the religious nationalists, and yet they are technologically advanced. Modernizing. They're not like carrying. They're not like carrying like tom-toms like religious people are supposed to be doing. They're not like doing voodoo sacrifices like they would expect religious people to be doing. So that is frightening to them.
Right. One of the, again, interesting, the Europeans were very important, but there's been a change in terms of Israel, India, Brazil, some of the Arab world, so many dramatic things happening that are definitely very, very, very beneficial to Israel. And, the question becomes, also going back to the deal of the century from the Trump administration, nobody really knows for sure, what is going to happen if Israel moves ahead with the United States at the present time in terms of, making the communities of Judea and Samaria part of Israel. What's going to happen? Is there going to be another intifada? Is it going to
No, there's
blow
not going to
up?
be another intifada. No, the intifada.
Tell me why you think not. Tell me why you think
They don't have it in them. You can't just pull off an intifada. The intifada is not a spontaneous eruption of anger, as they say. It is a well-planned terror campaign.
Well, let me ask you a question. The first intifada, if I remember correctly, resulted from an Israeli truck losing its way. Am I off? And
No,
driving into a Palestinian
the
area.
second intifada resulted from Arik Sharon going up on Har Habayit. No, that's what the Palestinians claimed as their excuse. But things like this we've seen since. It's been quite well studied. It requires organization, infrastructure. Suicide vests don't grow on trees. People need to make them, plan them, etc. And in the 90s, Israel let their guard down and let the Palestinians develop this because they were, high on peace. But now now there's much more direct involvement in ensuring security, and they can't pull it off. That's why when things happen, it's like some stabbings, because those are easy to put together. They don't require much infrastructure.
There was a story that I saw one of the Israeli stations, maybe 13, 12, I'm not sure. They went in and interviewed many Palestinians, not dressed, pretending they were somebody else. And many of the people they interviewed actually supported this move. They actually wanted this to happen. Do you think there's a segment of the Arab population in Judea and Samaria that are so unhappy with what has happened with the Palestinian Authority, with Mahmoud Abbas, that they actually would prefer the Israelis to be more in control?
Certainly. But did you see the follow-up to that story? The interview with the Arabs?
They arrested some of those people.
They arrested the people and also their families.
Wow.
So it's very hard to know what the Palestinians actually want, because it's like in the Soviet Union. It's not serious to go and send journalists over and say, what do you think? Because they're typically not going to be honest, and because when they can find a few people to say not the party line, they're going to be arrested or disappeared. So it's you can't rely really on polling. But certainly that that position in the is many more Palestinians have that position than would be reflected in polls or something.
Yeah. Let me ask you one other thing, and I'd like to go to some people to ask questions if I can figure out how to do this. Some people have said, why does Israel need to do any of this right now? We have a government in America. No one has mentioned how many Jews are living in Judea and Samaria, how many more buildings. Remember the old days where every time Israel did construction, everybody went crazy, and there hasn't been a story in the media for a year or two, at least in America, about anything Israel is doing in Judea and Samaria. Why not just continue to build and to expand and nobody cares?
It's not true that nobody cares. There's a slight suspension of pressure because of the Trump administration, and it will resume at a much higher level after the Trump administration. And why did Obama pass Resolution 2334? Why couldn't he say, we have the Obama administration, we're criticizing settlements all the time, who needs a UN resolution? And the idea is to give it permanence and staying power into a potential next administration. That's obviously the reason. Right. But also, it still needs to do it for its own purposes, to say, we don't think that people living here are temporary. We think, we don't think that they're, just here until they get kicked out. We're not planning to kick them out.
Again, I want to ask you one other question just to get your reaction. Am I correct, going back into the history of the area called Palestine before 1948, that if you go back to the end of the 19th century, I just want to get this from you, Professor. My reading of history was that the Arabs were never interested in a state for Arabs or Palestinians, so-called Palestinian state. It was only after Jews began to arrive in Palestine in the late 19th century, 20th century, it was only at that point where things changed. Because the Jews were here and we're afraid of the Jews becoming whatever, am I correct? Was there ever a movement prior to the Jews for the Arabs living in those areas to create something for them.
No, but of course it was part of the Ottoman Empire. So until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there was no realistic prospect.
But there was no movement. I mean, the Jews, even during the Ottoman Empire, were,
after the Ottoman Empire,
there was a movement to go back to Palestine, to go back to Eretz Yisrael.
Yes, there was not like a Palestinian national movement. To the extent there was a desire to put this under Arab control after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, it was not as an independent state, but as some kind of satrapy or region of Syria, presumably.
Right. Let me try to get someone into this discussion. Do we have Jeffrey? Okay, maybe I'm a real. Hello, do we have you on, Jeffrey? Okay, I don't think we do.
Dov, I could just read the questions for you.
Okay, please go right ahead, Israel.
Okay, so we have a first question from Daniel Goldschmidt. Why is sovereignty not extended only and without notice instead of making so much noise about it?
It's hard to do anything in democracies without talking about it a lot. Even harder when you have two prime ministers. That's just, it's a defect of democratic governance. It's hard to do big things in secret.
Okay, Israel, we have another question?
Yep, several more. We have from Jeffrey Schwartz. What is the strongest argument made for why this is against international law, and how does one respond in an accurate way?
So we did that one already.
Good question.
From Matthew Skolnick, what precisely would change on the ground for Israelis living in Judea and Samaria?
So I addressed that also, I think, in part. They would not have to go through, a weird, complex military bureaucracy to get like a house built, to get a road built. They would be able to just be, which now there's an entirely separate system of government for them for many things: property law, environmental law, education, tourism. That wouldn't happen. That would make these places much more attractive. But also symbolically, it would be a sign that we're not planning to pre-cleanse Jews from this territory, as a favor for the Palestinians, that we're not going to evict people. We don't think your presence here is temporary. And that's a powerful symbolic and moral message.
Okay.
From Melvin Lipich, we have, assuming that Israel goes ahead, what material actions do you expect an incoming Democrat government to take after the US elections?
So it all depends. It depends on what happens in the Senate. It depends on what else is happening in the world. But I want to contest the premise, assuming Israel goes ahead. I think the incoming adverse actions of the Democratic administration will be very much the same, regardless. Biden isn't going to say, "Oh, Israel didn't annex, so now like the wish list of my progressive backers on the Middle East, I'm not going to do it." So I think they are going to try to condition aid. They're going to try to reduce aid, mess with aid, say things aren't going to go unless you promise money's not going to come unless you promise it doesn't go across the green line. But basically they're going to try to walk it back. They would for sure revoke recognition. I don't think they would immediately recognize a Palestinian state, but they might make some symbolic steps along the way. And I think that's what they're going to do, but let's say Israel doesn't do it. Then they can't start by revoking the recognition of what Trump did. So they're going to have to start a step before by revoking recognition of Jerusalem or the Golan. It's last in, first out. So whatever the last nice thing Trump did for Israel is going to be the first thing they take on. So, I'd rather that list be longer than shorter.
I also think, just on that note, if you go through administrations over the last 30 years, you've had your ups and downs. You've had presidents who were better friends, less friends, threaten more, threaten less. But at the end of the day, if Israel is strong and Israel follows the path that it feels that it is right, Israel survives. That's not the issue. There is no question. A Democratic administration, it's going to be very difficult, very, very tough. There's no question about that. But look, Israel is used to that. But doing this under the auspices of an American president and an American administration today is very, very important. Very, very. That's why time, I believe, is of the essence. The faster this gets done, let everybody yell and scream. But America says, look, we're offering a deal. We're offering, I mean, by the way, let us remember that the deal of the century includes a Palestinian state, which a lot of Israelis are not happy with. But it does include a Palestinian state. It is a deal that some people have argued actually is a good deal for everybody. So it's not so simple, but it's going to be, if the Democrats win, and especially if they win the Senate, it's going to be very, very tough. But Israel is used to challenges. This will not be the toughest challenge for Israel ever, but it will be a real challenge. Israel, can we go to someone else?
Sure. So the next question is from Stephen Dickstein. Is there a universally accepted definition of the term international law? If so, what's the definition?
There's nothing universally accepted in general. What is universally accepted? The standard definition of international law is rules that govern countries because of the consent of all the countries. So the international law is made through either treaties, i.e. countries sign an agreement that they're going to be governed by these rules, or universal practice of nations. That's kind of the definition.
Let me ask you, many of your colleagues in Israel, lawyers and people who practice international law, can you give us sort of a snapshot of where, what they're saying actually about this? And can you be specific for those who are opposed to this, someone that you respect, that you actually respect, give me their best argument. Someone asked you, like, what they say.
I told you, it's the same. They say, look, many of their arguments are not legal, they're prudential. This is going to lead to an international criminal court investigation, European sanctions, etc. But, again, those things are going to happen anyway. We're going to feel very stupid when we don't annex, and there's going to be the same international criminal court investigation as there would be anyway. But they said the United Nations has said this is occupied territory. So if you think the United Nations saying something makes it true, okay. The United Nations also said that Zionism is racism. Israel has no right to be a country. Does that make it true? The United Nations has a extraordinary, they have passed so many more resolutions about Israel than anything else. They have called Israel occupied. They've accused Israel of occupation in over 2,500 resolutions, I remember. I actually counted at one point. They have used the word occupation in relation to anything else in the world, a combination of 16 times for all the rest of the world.
Let me ask you, many people call Judea and Samaria occupied. It is occupied land. Occupied means that someone else, it was under the jurisdiction of someone else, and they had a right to controlling that. Who are they talking about? It's not Jordan. Who are those original owners of this land that Israel is doing something illegal?
They have a unique definition of occupation when it comes to Israel. I mean, I think that's quite clearly the case. Usually occupation is when you take territory of another country, but they're saying, but in this case, even though it didn't really belong to Jordans, good enough. But then that doesn't answer the question, which no one has an answer to. If it was occupied because it was at least under Jordanian control, then that was enough. Then the peace treaty with Jordan in 1994 would end the occupation, because under international law, any occupation only occurs when there's like a military conflict, a war. When you have a full peace treaty, there can be no occupation. So this is this is the world's only occupation that is not of the territory of another country. This is the only occupation that persists beyond a peace treaty. This is, shall we say, a very unique occupation.
Do you think?
I want to push back on some of these questions. What do people say here? What do people say there? Forget what people say, because it's not relevant. Because when they say it, they already know that they're talking about Israel. The way to see what people really say is wake up an international law professor in the middle of the night and say, Baluchistan has invaded, East Wallonia, but they've taken land from East Wallonia that East Wallonia occupied 19 years before from Baluchistan. Is it an occupation? They'd say no. Or I can fill in Morocco and Western Sahara, and that's why the European Union doesn't call it occupied.
Yeah. So what you're saying is it's about the Jews.
Yeah,
I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Because
about the Jews. I don't want to psychoanalyze it. I'll just say that the rules that are applied to Israel, that's psychological. I don't want to infer motives. One can very clearly say that the rules that are applied to Israel are not the rules that the same entities and people would apply anywhere else in the world.
do you think that Israel has
They have
done?
a word for it, by the way. Some people say that because when you call something in Latin, it sounds nicer. They say Israel has a sui generis status, like unique.
Right.
Great.
Do you think that Israel over the years, because the issue of this land, Judea and Samaria, you just pointed it out, there are basic facts in terms of whose land is this? Well, it's my land. You think it's your land. You think it's your land. Okay. That's the status. We're arguing about this. Do you think that Israel has done enough over the years to make it very clear this is not occupied land?
No.
This is
almost certainly it has not.
Yeah.
Almost certainly it has not. And that's because, some people hoped that by calling it occupied, it would lead to internal political pressure to achieve what they believed was the correct settlement. That they were, leading Israel to do what was good for itself, as it were. But I think one of the great things about this application of Israeli law is it would be a very clear statement that it's not occupied, and that's one of the most important reasons to do it.
Right. Israel,
Because
do we have someone else?
If Israel holds on to this for 53 years without making such a clear statement, it gets questionable.
Right.
Next question.
Israel, are we ready?
Sure. Next question is from Eric Pastman. Is there anything reasonable that Israel or the U.S. can do to bring the Palestinians to the negotiation table?
No. I mean, more reasonable than offering them a state on 96% of the West Bank and all of Gaza, as has been done in the past.
Right.
Done.
What else? What else can you possibly offer? Exactly.
101%.
But you know what? This is
How about a complete freeze on settlement building? Tried that.
Right. Well, look, Netanyahu during his first 9 months when he became prime minister, did something that angered everybody. He stopped construction in Judea and Samaria, and nobody came to the table. No one talked.
Yep.
It's amazing, absolutely amazing that the world, nobody changes, nothing changes. That's the thing.
On the last day of the freeze, the boss said, "Oh wait, I'm willing to come to the table, but you need to
remember that. Yes.
To give me another year." So what were you doing with
that's exactly the point. No one cares about the facts. Don't confuse me with the facts. Don't talk to me about 1948. There were going to be two states. We could have avoided all of this back in 1948. And we know what happened. And on and on and on and on, as we pointed out, two prime ministers, I believe, offered a deal that would have jeopardized Israel's existence. But the deal was on the table.
Yeah. Okay. One or two more questions.
Okay. Israel?
We have another question from Arnold Levine. Will Israel stop the EU from funding humanitarian facilities in Area C for the Palestinians?
Very unlikely. They are not even successful at stopping them from building illegal settlements from the Palestinians, unfortunately.
Okay, Israel?
Aaron Farkas asks, can we call this anything but annexation? What would
Yes, you should call it anything but annexation. I would call it the application of Israeli law, Israeli civilian jurisdiction.
We need a one-liner,
There's no one-liner because it's such a boring, technical, humdrum thing. It's not like a big dramatic thing, like a land grab. I would call it perfecting sovereignty or something like that, or applying Israeli law.
Okay, that's what we're going to call it, applying Israeli law. By the way, right now,
military rule. That sounds even better. Ending military rule.
What happens right now in Efrat or any of these communities in terms of what law is applied in these communities at the present time, the last 30 years?
Ottoman land law. That's why it takes them so long to build anything.
So, and if someone commits a crime.
No, so criminal law is Israeli. It's a patchwork, and that makes it even more confusing.
So it's a piece of this and a piece of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Israel, we have one more question.
Yes, one more again from Stephen Dickstein. Do you believe a Biden presidency would present Israel with an existential peril?
Existential is a big word. Very big headache and dangerous diplomatic erosion, almost certainly. I mean, not in this way, not with the Palestinian thing. It would be a very big problem, but I wouldn't call it existential. I mean, because it depends. You can't force Israel to do anything Israel doesn't want to do. So in the end, it's up to Israel. It would be certainly a big diplomatic setback. I think, on another note, let me put it this way: it's quite clear that the broad bipartisan unity government of Israel thinks, across the parties, thinks that there is going to be an existential threat in a Biden administration. And that is why there are fires and explosions at Iranian industrial facilities every single day for 3 weeks now, because there seems to be a big sense that there's very likely that Biden would return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to promote an Iranian nuclear weapon, and to limit, and also, if you recall, the JCPOA also pledged America to protect the Iranian nuclear program from anyone else wanting to take it on. So Israel had to, sit on its hands. So it's quite clear that this is a preparation for the Biden administration.
Yeah. One final question. In terms of the people of Israel, I've read polls in terms of where are the people of Israel in terms of applying Israeli law to the communities of Judea and Samaria. Is it basically something that is overwhelmingly support or mixed or concern?
Polls all depends on how you frame the question, but I think it's quite clear that Israel elected a broad unity government with like 70 some members that is pledged to support this.
Right.
Big government
ever. Listen, Professor, I appreciate so much, the information you've presented. And not only that, I think the message, we got to do what we have to do. We have to do the right thing. And, we have a tendency, we Jews, and I understand why, we're always concerned about what everybody's going to say. We want to be loved.
You have to understand that they're going to say it anyway.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. It's at the end of the day, unless you make them happy, we're going to have a problem. And Israel cannot make the world happy. Israel needs to protect its people. That's its priority, period.
Exactly. Thank you all for joining me.
Thank you so much, and be well and be safe.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Take care. All the best to you. Bye-bye.